In the early stages of the World War I, Montrealers offered their services as volunteers, but because the majority of the French Montrealers opposed forced conscription, enlistment declined. After the war, the Prohibition movement in the United States turned Montreal became a destination for the Americans searching for alcohol. Americans traveled to Montreal for its drinking, gambling, and prostitution, unequaled in North America at this time, which gave the city the moniker Sin City. Montreal had a population of 618,000 in the early 1930s, increasing to 903,000 in 1941. The 20s witnessed many changes in the city, and the advent of the new technology continued to have a notable influence. The arrival of the vehicle in huge numbers began to affect the nature of the metropolis. The world's first commercial radio station, XWA, began airing. In preparation for transatlantic lighter-than-air passenger service, a sizable mooring pool for dirigibles was built at the St. Hubert. However, only one craft, the R-100, visited in 1930, and the service never took off. However, Montreal became the eastern hub of the Trans-Canada Airway in 1939. Film production became a component of the city activity. Two famous newsreel series were produced by Associated Screen News of Canada in Montreal: Canadian Cameo from 1932 to 1953 and Canogram in the 1920s. The manufacturing of the documentary films developed enormously during the World War II, with the founding of the National Film Board of Canada in Montreal in 1939. Unemployment was significant during the Great Depression in Canada in 1930s. Canada began to recover from the Great Depression in the mid-1930s, and real estate investors began to build skyscrapers, transforming Montreal's skyline. The Sun Life skyscraper, erected in 1931, was for a time the highest skyscraper in British Commonwealth. During World War II, its walls were utilized as the hiding location for the gold bullion of the Bank of England and the British Crown jewels. With so many males unemployed, women had to skimp on expenditures to match the lower family budget. About a fourth of the workforce were women, although most women were housewives. Dennis Baillargeon utilizes oral histories to learn how Montreal housewives dealt with a lack of resources and cash during the Great Depression. Often they updated tactics their moms employed while they were growing up in the disadvantaged households. Soups, beans, and noodles were used as inexpensive meals. They recycled the Sunday roast into sandwiches and soups by buying the cheapest cuts of meat, sometimes even horse meat. They stitched and patched garments, swapped with their neighbors for outgrown stuff, and kept the home chilling. New furnishing and appliances were postponed until better days. Half of the Catholic women disregarded church teachings and used contraceptions to postpone pregnancies. The number of the births worldwide decreased from 250,000 to 1930 to roughly 228,000 and did not recover until the late 1930s. In September 1939, Canada declared war on Germany, which led to an economic boom that eradicated the final signs of the Great Depression. Mayor Camillien Houde protested against conscription. He warned Montrealers that the federal government's register of all men and women would result in conscription and advised them to disregard it. The federal government at Ottawa, considering Houde's act treasonable, jailed him in a prison camp at the Petawawa, Ontario, for nearly 4 years, from 1940 to 1944. Conscription was put in place that year in order to strengthen the armed forces and take on the Axis powers. Starting in 1930, Montreal began a period of turmoil that would endure 15 odd years. The Great Depression put an abrupt end to the optimism of the preceding declare, throwing the city into an economic catastrophe that would touch the whole population to varying degrees. This relentless depression was followed by the Second World War, which, though it provided affluence, was still an exception that further delayed a return to the regular living. The crash of the 1929 formally heralded the beginning of the Great Depression. The economy saw a sharp fall between 1930 and 1933, and the ultimate recovery that followed would be painfully sluggish. This recession caught Montreal off guard. and it had a particularly negative impact on the global trade in natural resources. These sectors' dependent industries collapsed, and a domino effect extended to other areas of the economy as a result. The resources of the workforce were swiftly spent, making it impossible for them to participate in the economic recovery through consumer spending. Charities were quickly inundated. The city formed an unemployment commission to deliver government help or direct relief to employees. It also developed public works initiatives that hired many thousand jobless employees. Immigrants were particularly vulnerable to unemployment during the Great Depression in the 1930s, a time of rising Canadian nativism. The Canadian government established exclusionary immigration policies, placing harsh limitations to entrance and significantly increasing deportation. Unsuitable immigrants, such as those in a jail or hospitals, or otherwise living at public cost, were significant targets for exclusion and expulsion. The average yearly deportation rate surged to 6 times the previous standard, and immigration standards were regularly overloaded. The pace of the deportation was such that in 1931, the immigration quarters in Montreal were over capacity, packed with persons being deported back to their countries of origin. In the 1930s, only few bookshops existed, but today bookshops can be found in all districts and shopping centers, and New Canadians, as new immigrants are called, may buy books, reviews, and magazines in their home languages. The municipal library has various branches, and special libraries are placed across the city. When the new Havre Bridge, now known as the Jacques Cartier Bridge, opened in 1931, the network had grown dramatically and offered service to the Languel and St. Helens Island. But Division had 155 vehicles and carried over 20 million people annually by the early 1930s. In the late 1930s, many British-built trolley buses were placed into service on the Bobine Street as buses began to supplant tramways. Known as Canada's fashion capital, Montreal is the third top city in North America for apparel production and contains over 70% of the enterprises in the clothing and fashion industry. Additionally, it received UNESCO City of Design status in 2006, enhancing its standing as a global creative powerhouse. At the start of the 20th century, the city became a hub for new designers, manufacturers, retailers, artisans, innovators, and entrepreneurs thanks to the improvements combined with the city's advantageous location. At the start of the 20th century, the Government of Canada substantially promoted the expansion of the international trade and internal infrastructure, and as a result provided for numerous tax breaks and municipal subsidies to encourage entrepreneurs to construct factories, workshops, and textile mills. This effort developed Montreal into an industrial powerhouse by the middle of the 20th century. In the 1920s, during the Prohibition in the USA, many Americans visited Montreal for a good time and the city boomed. Jacques Cartier Bridge inaugurated in 1930 and Montreal Botanical Gardens were created in 1931. However, like the rest of the globe, Montreal struggled during the Depression of the 1930s. Nevertheless, Sun Life Building was finished in 1931 and Atwater Market opened in 1933. Furthermore, wealth returned to Montreal during the Second World War. By 1951, the population of the Montreal was above 1 million. The place Jacques Cartier, one of the Montreal's oldest and most scenic squares. For more than 150 years, from the 1803 until the end of the 1950s, it was the core of a thriving market district that extended down from the City Hall and east towards the Bonco's Market. Twice a week, merchants from throughout the Quebec congregated in the square to offer fresh food and other things. As old Montreal's residential population rises, and Montreal's became increasingly interested in fresh, locally produced food, would it be far-fetched to suppress the place Jacques Cartier might for at least a couple of days every week? The Port Montreal has had the honor of bearing witness to the founding of the Montreal, the growth of its economy, the migration of the people to the area. 6 months after the stock market crisis in 1929, the Jacques Cartier Bridge opened to the automobile traffic, and the port was prospering. However, the depression of the 1930s would briefly lead to a fall at the port as well as the grain market. Do you also want to experience living in the Montreal in the 1930s? Let me know your comments and thoughts below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. We'll see you on the next video.